So we'll keep today's opening remarks short to hold greater space for the seminar's summative discussion later. I'm Jacob Henry Leviton, a new member of the School of Materialist Research, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's final meeting of Marx and Engels, the Dialectic of Theory and Practice, led by Reid Kane. For those just joining us for the first time today, the School of Materialist Research, or SMR, is an education and research inter-university platform that offers integrated credit programs, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the many materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. The SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at TU Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven. I'm also pleased to announce today the SMR Summer Institute program, Mythoplanetarities, Critical and Speculative Practices in Design Research at our campus in Olympiada, Greece. That'll be August 3rd through the 9th and include the courses Planet Earth plus or minus 30%, led by Jimmy Liwazo, Matt Ward and Duncan Fairfax, Acousmatics and the Designing of Sound Justice with Stephen Liu, and Mythic Matters in Design, led by Stacy Moran and Adam Nocek. It'll be a great way to continue our conversation, thinking of the post-classicality of post-Marxist theoretically informed design in the wake of Marx's work on philosophies of nature, John Bellamy Foster, Ian Angus, and others' work on ecological rift theory and more. So we're glad you're here. We hope you'll get there. That is to Mythoplanetarities in Greece. And Reid, take it away.
Thank you, Jacob. And I just wanted to say thank you to the School of Materialist Research for hosting me. I'm very grateful. And for everyone that's participated or has watched the streams or the videos, I'm very grateful. And as I've said in the previous few sessions, the material I'm going to be presenting and that I have presented thus far is a great deal more condensed and leaves a lot out that I would have rather not have left out, but that's the nature of this sort of thing. It's a much broader project than I could realistically squeeze into the time limit of this seminar. So I did the best I could, but there is a lot missing from this final session that will probably be noticeable if you're familiar with the history. I did want to say before I begin that I intend sometime, probably relatively soon, maybe within the next few weeks or few months, I do intend to present a much more thoroughgoing and slower paced treatment of the same material, including a lot of writing I did for these lectures that I wasn't able to fit into the actual seminar sessions. I'm not sure where or what form that's going to be or what form that's going to take, but you can follow me on Twitter or X at my username, I think is on the screen, at Socialist Legacy, if you want to be updated on that. So thank you again, and I'll take it away. I'm going to begin with an epigraph from a letter Engels wrote to Marx on December 18th of 1868. Engels wrote, "It necessarily happens after every victorious reaction that the causes of the revolution and counter-revolution are totally forgotten. In Germany, the younger generation knows absolutely nothing about 1848, except the lamentations of the Kreutzeitung, reactionary newspaper, and the echoing howls of all the other papers from 1849 to 1852. History suddenly comes to an end there in 1847. In Marx's first article for the Rheinische Zeitung, after becoming its editor in the autumn of 1842, defending it from an attack by a reactionary rival for having published articles avowing communist ideas, he concluded by stating that the paper does not admit that communist ideas in their present form possess even theoretical reality, and therefore can still less desire their practical realization, or even consider it possible. While Marx was skeptical at the time of the communist ideas being promoted by fellow editor Moses Hess, he saw the paper as doing the duty of the free press in raising an important question of the time, a philosophical question in which the public had taken an interest. It was precisely as an enemy of philosophy that the Allgemeine Zeitung criticized the Rheinische Zeitung for raising the question of communism. Yet Marx pointed out their hypocrisy, as communist principles are being disseminated in Germany not by liberals, but by your reactionary friends. And the Augsburg paper had itself published a correspondent who suggested the monarchy ought to try to appropriate socialist and communist ideas in its own way in order to win the support of the people away from the Liberal Party. Rather than using communism as a means, on the one hand, to frighten the public, and on the other hand, to promise heaven and earth, Marx pledged to subject these ideas to thoroughgoing criticism. He recognized the question of communism was not only of interest in France and England, but of European importance, precisely for having been used as a phrase by the Augsburg newspaper, in reaction to the public's interest in the question, and the prospect of a repetition of 1789, in which the estate that today owns nothing will demand to share in the wealth of the middle classes. The Allgemeine Zeitung warned against the unwashed reality of communist ideas as they were practiced in France, with which it had accused the Rheinische Zeitung of coquetting, holding out the possibility of a distinctively German communism that retained its theoretical purity by expressing itself in harmony with the feudalistic spirit, rather than through the rebellion of man's subjective wishes against the objective views of his mind. Marx, by contrast, saw it as necessary to take seriously such theoretical works as those of Leroux, Considerant, and above all, the sharp-witted work by Proudhon, which cannot be criticized on the basis of superficial flashes of thought, but only after long and profound study. He explained, "We are firmly convinced that the real danger lies not in practical attempts, but in the theoretical elaboration of communist ideas. For practical attempts, even mass attempts, can be answered by canon as soon as they become dangerous, whereas ideas, which have conquered our intellect and taken possession of our minds, ideas to which reason has fettered our conscience, are chains from which one cannot free oneself without a broken heart. They are demons which human beings can vanquish only by submitting to them." Marx would never relinquish this basic notion. Practical reason is driven to clarify itself through its attempts to achieve its aims by learning from its successes and failures, through experience. The state is an inherently conservative force and hence will be driven to repress social activity that destabilizes social order. While Marx could not have espoused openly revolutionary views under the censorship, he would soon, if he did not already, hold the further view that a revolutionary situation in which a social crisis undermines the state's ability to maintain order reflected the emergence of a superior force in society on which the power of the state had come to depend, and whose development was constrained by the existing political and legal forms, coming into conflict with them, destabilizing these forms and their social foundation alike. The question then was whether society, rather than collapsing beneath the weight of the inherited forms of social life, could break through the shell and develop from out of itself the remnants of the old world. To develop from out of itself and the remnants of the old world, new forms adequate to its continuing development, to further progress in freedom. Theoretical reason, on the other hand, is too easily captured by ideas of its own creation, products of imagination and speculation, which hold us captive regardless of whether they are adequate to reality. Even ostensibly practical aims can be so idealized, detached from the reality of their implementation. That the theoretical practice of devotion to the aim as an idea becomes a substitute for the practical effort to bring it about. Or else, practical efforts become detached from the realization of the idea and instead come to focus on the pragmatic necessities related to the perpetuation of the theoretical practice itself and the people engaged in this practice. Sometimes efforts will be made to bridge the divide between an idealized end and inadequate means through bold experiments. But if the failure of such experiments is always attributed to those inadequacies, to the inadequacies of the means of material reality, to accidental circumstances, in order to protect the integrity of the idea, this results in either an endlessly self-defeating form of practice that grows content with its own futility, condemning the world for failing to conform to its vision of what the world ought to be, or in the notion that putting the idea into practice will require unlimited control over circumstances, and hence an appeal for or an appeal to absolute power, as we will see in the case of Lassalle shortly. Hence, there was a real need to combat this tendency of theoretical reason, of the activity of the intellectuals, specifically the socialist and communist visionaries, to help the dogmatists clarify their propositions for themselves. While Marx submitted to the demon of communism, he did so in order to vanquish it, that is, to do away with it as an abstraction detached from reality. And this would require enduring a broken heart, that is, enduring practical failures and defeats. He did not simply accept the idea as a practical goal, but submitted it to the dialectical method, the theoretical practice of ruthless criticism, to develop from the conflict of the actually existing forms of theoretical and practical consciousness fettered by this idea, the social truth, the true reality as their obligation and their final goal, to elaborate the real practical needs expressed in this distorted theoretical reflection. Such theoretical dogmatism or sectarianism was Marx's major concern, the real danger. In this, Marx was continuing the criticism of religion of the young Hegelians, itself a continuation of the critical idealism of Kant and Hegel, which was in turn a critical transformation of both the materialism and idealism that preceded it, the culmination of their dialectic, of the dialectic of materialism and idealism. As Marx would later put it, every sect is in fact religious. Yet Marx was not content with the criticism of religion, which by the end of 1843, he considered to be essentially completed. If man makes religion, religion does not make man, then why did man subordinate himself to his own creation? Already in March of 1843, Marx had expressed to Ruge that Feuerbach refers too much to nature and too little to politics, whereas Marx had concluded that it was only in alliance with the political struggle that present-day philosophy can become truth. For Marx, man becomes estranged from his own creation and confronts it as an alien force opposing him, because the world of man, the state and society, was an inverted world which produced an inverted consciousness of the world. Quote, religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Opium, of course, was a common painkiller at the time, one Marx had occasion to use himself, serving an essential function so long as there was pain whose source could not be removed. But it also contained the danger of addiction, the means of treating the pain becoming an end in itself. Marx would later explain the development of the system of socialist sects and that of the real workers' movement always stand in inverse ratio to each other. So long as the sects are historically justified, the working class is not yet ripe for an independent historic movement. As soon as it has attained this maturity, all sects are essentially reactionary. The defeat of the Revolution of 1848 and the ensuing period of reaction and political persecution were a nearly fatal blow to the nascent workers' movement in Germany, and it fell into 15 years of slumber. A slow recuperation began, during the 1850s, beginning with the self-help movement spearheaded by the liberal Franz Hermann Schulze-Delitzsch, promoting the formation of mutual aid associations, friendly societies, akin to what we now call credit unions, although less kind of professionalized, and consumer and producer cooperatives as a solution to the social question. Yet the Crimean War of 1854 through 55, it's really longer than that, but primarily during that period, upended the continental balance of powers that had held since the defeat of Napoleon, and the industrial crisis of 1857 put an end to the period of prosperity that undermined the revolutionary movement of the prior decade, and again set the thrones tottering. In the early 1860s, the accession of the new king of Prussia, Wilhelm I, reopened the possibility of German unification under a constitution, leading to the formation of the Liberal Progress Party, of which Schulze-Delitzsch was a founder. Yet the liberals in the Prussian parliament, who held the power to approve requests for tax revenue, soon found themselves embroiled in a conflict with the government over funding for a military buildup, which came to a head in 1862. To resolve the deadlock, the king appointed Otto von Bismarck head of the government, who promptly delivered his famous address to the Budget Committee, concluding that it is not by speeches and majority resolutions that the great questions of the time would be decided. That was the big mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by blood and iron. Actually said iron and blood in the original speech. Bismarck failed to persuade the liberal deputies, but he exploited the ambiguity of the existing constitution to insist that the rejection of the budget allowed the government to revert to the previous budget, on the basis of which he continued collecting taxes without parliamentary approval to fund the military reform. The working men's associations began to lose faith in the political leadership of the liberals and to consider anew the possibility raised by the Communist League in 1849 that the workers should form their own independent political party. During this same period, Ferdinand Lassalle, a former member of the Communist League who fought in the Revolution of 1848, had returned to Berlin. LaSalle confronted the liberals for concerning themselves with a new constitution, while neglecting the fact that without political power, power over the state, they could neither impose a constitution on the government nor hold the government to its constitutional duty. He reminded, as the budget episode demonstrates, he reminded them that royalty, gentlemen, has practical servants, not phrasemongers, and such practical servants as you yourselves might wish to have. Yet the liberals, for the most part, were weary of the prospect of another revolution. LaSalle then turned to the working class the antagonistic interests they had to organize a permanent campaign of agitation for universal suffrage. Thus, as Marx put it, LaSalle uh, had performed the immortal service of having reawakened the workers' movement in Germany. Workers' associations inspired by LaSalle united to form the General German Workers' Association for the sake of pursuing his program, and elected him president, an office that the highly centralized organization entrusted with practically dictatorial powers. To win workers away from the liberal leadership, LaSalle attacked the self-help doctrine of the cooperative movement, as well as the notion of trade union organization, which basically didn't exist in Germany at the time, claiming both were doomed under capitalism due to the so-called iron law of wages, which Marx criticized as essentially a cribbing of the Malthusian theory of population. Marx was very contemptuous of LaSalle for this and totally rejected this perspective. I just wanted to note that because I forgot to put it in the remainder. It was only by state aid, according to LaSalle, that the workers could expect any relief from their impoverished conditions, specifically through a scheme of establishing producers' cooperatives financed by state credit, a demand that had formerly been raised, as Marx notes, by the Catholic reactionary socialists against the proletarian socialists in France. Yet, having isolated himself and his followers from the liberal opposition to Bismarck's state, and having rejected social action as a means of redressing the conditions of the working class, in favor of insisting only state power could provide any relief, the appeal of the Lassallean program was limited for the more practically minded working men, especially those no more inclined to trust the state than the liberals. These reforms would have to become possible in the immediate future for the organization to maintain its momentum. And so LaSalle turned to Bismarck, secretly trying to convince him to grant the workers suffrage and state aid in order to win their support for his government and squash the liberal opposition. Yet before anything could come of this, LaSalle was killed in a duel in August of 1864. The following month in London, Marx attended a meeting organized by English and French veterans of the revolutions of 1848 to reestablish an international organization of the working class, at which was founded the International Working Men's Association, or the First International. He had mostly rebuffed or skeptically observed similar efforts over the previous decade, preferring to focus on his book on political economy, rather than being dragged back into the intrigues and recriminations into which the revolutionary movement had descended. Yet during the previous years, it was evident that the workers in England, too, were beginning to stir, most notably in their successful campaign to prevent the British government from intervening in the US Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, despite the blockade of cotton imports, shutting down the textile industry and driving many of them into unemployment. Within a few months, in an address on behalf of the International to President Abraham Lincoln, Marx would proudly announce that from the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class, for they understood that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy crusade of property against labor, and that for the men of labor, with their hopes for the future, even their past conquests were at stake in that tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic, and felt certain that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. Marx was elected to the new organization's executive committee and appointed to write its program. In a letter to Engels recounting these events, he opined that it was very difficult to frame the thing so that our view should appear in a form acceptable from the present standpoint of the workers' movement, which had been dramatically diminished by over a decade of counter-revolution. It will take time before the reawakened movement allows the old boldness of speech, Marx noted, and hence it was necessary to be bold in substance, mild in form. Nonetheless, in his preamble to the International's general rules, Marx declared that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves, what Marx scholar Hal Draper termed the principle of self-emancipation, which Engels would later describe as the notion defining their shared perspective from the very beginning. Marx continued by asserting that the struggle for the emancipation of the working classes means not a struggle for class privileges and monopolies, but for equal rights and duties and the abolition of all class rule, as the economical subjection of the man of labor to the monopolizer of the means of labor, that is, the source of life, lies at the bottom of servitude in all its forms, of all social misery, mental degradation, and political dependence. Therefore, the economical emancipation of the working classes is the great end to which every political movement ought to be subordinate as a means. Marx warned that the revival of the movement represented by the International, while it raises a new hope, gives solemn warning against a relapse into the old errors. Specifically, it called for the immediate combination of the still disconnected movements, for the failures of previous efforts had been due to the want of solidarity between the manifold divisions of labor in each country, and from the absence of a fraternal bond of union between the working classes of different countries. The lesson to be learned, and that the International had to embody, was that the emancipation of labor is neither a local nor a national, but a social problem, embracing all countries in which modern society exists, and depending for its solution on the concurrence, practical and theoretical, of the most advanced countries. Marx expanded on this point in his inaugural address of the International Workingmen's Association. He recounted that while the period from 1848 to 1864 had been unrivaled for the development of its industry and the growth of its commerce, it is a great fact that the misery of the working masses has not diminished. While a minority of the working classes got their real wages somewhat advanced, everywhere the great mass of the working classes were sinking down to a lower depth at the same rate, at least, that those above them were rising in the social scale. And this was compounded with the quickened return, the widening compass, and the deadlier effects of the social pest called a commercial and industrial crisis, as had recently been demonstrated in the Panic of 1857. Hence, it was evident that no improvement of machinery, no appliance of science to production, no contrivances of communication, no new colonies, no emigration, no opening of markets, no free trade. Not all these things put together will do away with the miseries of the industrious masses, but that on the present false base, every fresh development of the productive powers of labor must tend to deepen social contrasts and point social antagonisms. Yet, after the failure of the revolution of 1848, all party organizations and party journals of the working classes were on the continent crushed by the iron hand of force. The most advanced sons of labor fled in despair to the transatlantic republic, and the short lived dreams of emancipation vanished before an epoch of industrial fever, moral marism, and the ruling classes, their withdrew concessions already advertised, most notably the limitation of the working day for women and children to 10 hours. The exodus of workers to America left an irreparable void in the ranks of the British proletariat, as did the workers won over to the political leadership of the reaction. Apathy of the masses, and in point of working class so thoroughly reconciled to a state of political nullity. If then there had been no solidarity of action between the British and the continental working classes, there was, at all events, a solidarity of defeat. And Marx noted there had been at least two significant victories in this period. The 10 Hours Bill that had been enacted in 1847 was effectively nullified by a court decision in 1850, much to the relief of the industrial capitalists and the political economists who, in Marx's estimation, vulgarized the science of Smith and Ricardo by turning it into an apologia for the interests of the ruling class. Engels wrote at the time that the working man, ground down to the dust, trodden upon, physically ruined and mentally exhausted by a haughty class of money-loving mill lords, the working man certainly would deserve his fate if he did not feel his blood mount into his cheeks upon being very coolly told that he is doomed forever to serve as a piece of machinery, to be used and misused as it suits his lord, for the greater glory and the more rapid accumulation of capital. And that it is under this condition only that the ascendancy of his country and the existence of the working class itself can be made to continue. Were it not for this feeling of passionate, revolutionary indignation, there would be no hope for proletarian emancipation. While the 10 Hours Bill had given the workers the satisfaction of an indispensable physical need by protecting their health to some extent from the manufacturer's frenzy for exploitation, Engels nonetheless did not bemoan its nullification, for it taught the workers an essential political lesson. The bill had originally been championed by the reactionary financial aristocracy, who took it over from Robert Owen, but it was politically championed by the reactionary party, ostensibly as a philanthropic measure, but really as a means of fettering the new, but really as a means of fettering the rising industrial bourgeoisie, undermining the political ascent of this new rival by undermining its ability to produce wealth. Yet while the revolutionary section of the working class, the Chartists, were for the 10 hours bill to the last man, they refused to collaborate with the reactionary party in any way, raising the demand separately. By contrast, the workers who followed the lead of the reactionary party, as Engels puts it, were completely broken, exhausted by work, placid, God fearing, respectable folk who felt a pious abhorrence towards Chartism and socialism, who held throne and altar in due respect, and who, too crushed to hate the industrial bourgeoisie, only retained the capacity for humble veneration of the aristocracy, which at least deigned to interest itself in their misery. This working class Toryism was just as reactionary as were the bourgeois and aristocratic chiefs of the 10 Hours Party. Romantic ideologues reveling in the memory of vanished patriarchal forms of hole and corner exploitation with their train of religiosity, domesticity, virtue, and narrow mindedness, and with their stable, traditionally inherited ways. The petty bourgeois frame of mind of these soft hearted ideologues was horrified in the presence of these new forces of production shooting up with magical suddenness. Their narrow skulls were seized with dizziness by the revolutionary maelstrom of industry and opposed it from the standpoint of morality, humanity, and compassion against the pitiless harshness and ruthlessness with which this process of upheaval asserted itself, and to oppose to it as their social ideal the stability, the stagnant comfort, and moral complacency of dying patriarchalism. Indeed, exclusively protecting their health from being too rapidly ruined, but gave them nothing which could make them dangerous to their reactionary allies. It gave them no political power and did not alter their social position as wage laborers. On the contrary, it kept them under the influence and partly under the leadership of the reactionary section of the ruling class. Such an alliance was quite natural, especially at the start of the industrial upheaval, according to Engels. But as it adulterated the labor movement with a strong reactionary admixture, which is only gradually disappearing, and reinforced significantly the reactionary, that is, petty bourgeois element within the labor movement. Um, Yet the bill was only able to pass in 1847 over the opposition of the liberal bourgeoisie because the old parties had fallen into crisis and were dissolved, while the new ones had not yet taken shape, which liberated the workers from their alliance with the sentimental dreamers, from their solidarity with all the reactionary classes, enabling the labor movement to concentrate wholly on achieving the political rule of the proletariat as the prime means of transforming the whole of existing society, which thereby forced the reactionary factions of the ruling classes into an alliance with the industrial bourgeoisie to suppress them. Because the 10 Hours Bill had been advocated mainly by reactionaries and carried exclusively by reactionary classes as a means of impeding the development of industry, it was therefore a thoroughly reactionary measure, which the industrial bourgeoisie overturned at their earliest opportunity. Yet the workers considered it to be a physical necessity. Learned the value of an alliance, separate partial measures against the industrial bourgeoisie. Namely, that it was a vain task to work against them in their progressive mission. Thus, Engels observed, in spite of the direct and not in the least dormant hostility toward the industrialists, the workers are now much more inclined to support them in their agitation for the complete implementation of free trade, financial reform, and extension of the franchise, than to allow themselves to be decoyed once again by philanthropic allurements to the banner of the united reactionaries. They feel that their day can only come when the industrialists have worn themselves out, and hence their instinct is correct in hastening the process of development which will give the industrialists power and thus prepare their fall. But because of this, they do not forget that in the industrialists, they are bringing to power their own direct enemies, and that they can achieve their own liberation only through toppling the industrialists and conquering political power for themselves. The annulment of the 10 Hours Bill has once more proved this to them in the most striking fashion. The restoration of this bill can only have any significance now under the rule of universal franchise. And universal franchise in England, 2/3 of whose inhabitants are industrial proletarians, means the exclusive political rule of the working class, with all the revolutionary changes in social conditions which are inseparable from it. The proletarian revolution will then be inevitable, and its victory certain. Thus Engels. Thus the demand for the 10-hour bill, the 10 Hours Bill in 1850, now had a completely different character. No longer a reactionary measure, an isolated attempt to cripple industrial development, but a revolutionary one, a link in a long chain of measures which will revolutionize the whole of the present form of society and gradually destroy the class antagonisms which have hitherto existed. While Chartism did not revive the universal suffrage, did not revive, and universal suffrage was not enacted for quite a ways into the future, a new act was passed later that year, following threatening meetings of workers in Lancashire and Yorkshire, leading the factory inspectors to urgently warn the government that the antagonism of classes had arrived at an incredible tension. This act left open a loophole by which the employers could have increased the working day for the adult male operatives, but this ultimately came to grief after 3 years of resistance. While this was a great practical success due to the immense physical, moral, and intellectual benefits that accrued to the factory operatives, and not only in England, as most of the continental governments had to accept the English Factory Act in more or less modified forms, it was more importantly the victory of a principle, as Marx put it. While the vulgar apologists of the capitalist class had warned it would spell the ruin of industry and of the English nation, this was belied by the wonderful development from 1853 to 1860 of the great branches of industry. Thus, it was the first time that in broad daylight, the political economy of the middle class, based upon the blind rule of the laws of supply and demand, succumbed to the political economy of the working class, based upon social production, controlled by social foresight. Still greater victory in this regard was that of the cooperative movement, especially the cooperative factories, whose seeds were sown by Robert Owen, and whose value, according to Marx, cannot be overrated. They had shown by deed instead of by argument, this is Marx, that production on a large scale and in accord with the behests of modern science may be carried out without the existence of a class of masters employing a class of hands. That to bear fruit, the means of labor need not be monopolized as a means of dominion over and of extortion against the laboring man himself. And that, like slave labor, like serf labor, hired labor is but a transitory and inferior form, destined to disappear before associated with a willing hand, a ready mind, would never be able to arrest the growth in masses. Class struggle. It looked like the connection just dropped. Am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on. You're good.
Yes, you are
Okay,
still on.
cool. Just making sure. Renewed class struggle. To realize the emancipatory potential of cooperative labor, it would have to be developed to national dimensions and consequently to be fostered by national means. Yet the lords of the land and the lords of capital will always use their political privileges for the defense and perpetuation of their economic monopolies. So far from promoting, they will continue to lay every possible impediment in the way of the emancipation of labor. Marx concluded that to conquer political power has therefore become the great duty of the working classes, and that as past experience has shown how disregard of the bond of brotherhood which ought to exist between the workmen of different countries and incite them to stand firmly by each other in all their struggles for emancipation will be chastised by the common discomfiture of their incoherent efforts. It was essential for proletarians of all countries to unite. Most importantly, in the face of the criminal designs of the ruling classes, who sought to play upon national prejudices in order to squander in piratical wars the people's blood and treasure, as the Crimean War had viscerally demonstrated in the previous decade. While Lassalle's organization carried on in Germany without him, a follower of Marx, Wilhelm Liebknecht, had become involved only to come into conflict with the Lassallean leadership, who were still seeking to forge an alliance of the Bismarck government with the workers and against the liberal bourgeoisie. Liebknecht ultimately split from the Lassallean organization to found a new party following the Marxist policy, which aligned itself with the liberals against the government. Marx and Engels aligned itself with the liberals from an independently organized standpoint. Initially, Liebknecht tried to form a class neutral party of workers and liberal bourgeois, which Marx and Engels criticized him for. But by 1869, the first working class party under Marxist leadership had formed. Marx and Engels appreciated the potential value of Marx and Engels had appreciated the potential value of universal suffrage, but unlike Lassalle, they had taken to heart the lesson of 1848 through 1852 in France, that universal suffrage would serve as a means of deception, of entrapping the masses into support for the reactionary state in the new modern form of Bonapartism, which balanced the interests of the workers and capitalists against one another through the unlimited power of an authoritarian bureaucracy, so long as the working class did not form itself into an independent party that would lead the struggle for liberal freedoms in society, which were essential for both the unfettered rule of the bourgeoisie and the subsequent development of the proletarian class struggle. Lassalle, by contrast, fell into Proudhon's mistake of not seeking the real basis of his agitation in the actual elements of the class movement, but of wishing instead to prescribe for the movement a course determined by a certain doctrinaire recipe. And thus, like everyone else who claims to have in his pocket a panacea for the sufferings of the masses, gave his agitation from the very start a religious, sectarian character. Marx warned his followers against pursuing such a sect movement, which seeks its raison d'etre and its point d'honneur not in what it has in common with the class movement, but in the particular shibboleth distinguishing it from that movement. Marx and Engels saw the formation of the International as a great historical development in having replaced the socialist or semi-socialist sects by a real organization of the working class for struggle. the sectarian members of the sectarian members of Proudhonist, Blanquist, and later Bakuninist persuasion Paris Commune, dominated by Proudhon. Positive advances and whose ultimate defeat were a definitive refutation of both tendencies and confirmation of Marx's policy of international revolution, led by an independent proletarian party. In the aftermath of the cannot act as a class itself into a political party, distinct from and opposed to all old parties formed by the propertied classes. This constitution of the working class into a political party is indispensable in order to ensure the triumph of the social revolution and of its ultimate end, the abolition of classes. The combination of forces which the working class has already affected by its economical struggles ought at the same time to serve as a lever for its struggles against the political power of landlords and capitalists. This would intensify an ongoing struggle against the faction led by Bakunin, who opposed political action, and who moreover sought to circumvent the democratic legitimacy of the decisions of the International, leading to the tendency's expulsion. Yet with this, Marx and Engels saw the historical role of the International as having been fulfilled, and looked to Liebknecht's party in Germany as pointing toward the next phase of development. The Lassallean organization, meanwhile, was collapsing. Marx wrote to its then president, Johann von Schweitzer, that this presented an opportunity to take a big step forward and declare that a new stage of development had been reached, as the sect movement was now ripe to merge into the class movement. With regard to the true content of the sect, it would, like all former workers' sects, carry this as an enriching element into the general movement, Marx said. He chided Schweitzer for having thus far, rather, demonstrated that the class movement demanded that the class movement subordinate itself to a particular sect movement, for having wished to conserve your own workers' movement under all circumstances. What was essential, rather, especially in Germany, where the worker is regulated bureaucratically from childhood onwards, where he believes in authority in those set over him, was to teach him to walk by himself. The sectarianism of a Lassalle or a Proudhon was characterized by the elevation of their theoretical perspective above the practical movement, an insistence that the latter follow the practical nostrums, quack cures, snake oil, according to Marx, that they prescribed. For Marx and Engels, by contrast, every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. They denied the accusation of Bakunin that they were secretly guiding the party of Liebknecht from London, reflecting Bakunin's own sectarian intentions to lead the movement through his own invisible dictatorship. Rather, Marx and Engels sought only to offer their criticisms from an independent standpoint through their publications and their correspondence. In a sense, the Marx-Engels party, after the International, reverts to the Communist Committees of Correspondence, although not in an official capacity. That was really the kind of substance of their practice. It was for the movement to determine for itself how to proceed and to learn or fail to learn from its errors. Marx and Engels warned of such errors, but it was for the working class movement to heed their advice or to ignore it. At every step, what was essential was that the movement advance in its struggle to a higher phase of development and avoid taking any retrograde steps from the standpoint of a class movement, a movement that is coming into conflict with the ruling class, both in social and economic action, and more importantly, in political action, to that of a sectarian movement that was preoccupied with its own theoretical perspective and practical nostrums. The sectarian promises of panaceas that would solve the social question and put an end to the class struggle not only misled the working class, according to Marx and Engels, but in the form of Bonapartism had become the real religion of the modern bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels, it should be noted, referred to Bonapartism as state socialism, imperial socialism, governmental socialism, reactionary socialism. Engels wrote to Marx that it is becoming more and more clear to me that the bourgeoisie has not the stuff in it to rule in society in the interests of leadership, upholding the big material interests of the bourgeoisie, even against the will of the bourgeoisie, but allowing the bourgeoisie no share in the government. Political reaction had been reborn no longer as a holdover from feudalism, but now on a purely democratic basis in which the state exists to maintain capitalist production while preventing the for liberal freedoms and the but from the standpoint of independent organization and clearly defined class independent perspectives, distinct, incompatible class interests. In other words, who was going to rule society? In Marx, in Paris, so this is just a kind of an epilogue, and then I'll conclude. In Paris, at the end of 1843, Marx had reflected that the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. Criticism of religion is therefore in embryo the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. The criticism of heaven, thus, had to give way to the criticism of the earth. The effort to discover by analysis the earthly core of the misty creations of religion was only preparation for the task of developing from the actual relations of life the corresponding celestialized forms of those relations. The latter, Marx writes in Capital, being the only materialistic and therefore the only scientific method, which he would also identify with the dialectical method. Marx poses the task of history, that of establishing the truth of this world, developing theoretical forms adequate to a social world that has ceased to need religious illusions and is trying to become philosophical as the completion of the Copernican revolution in philosophy inaugurated by Kant. Marx writes, criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers on the chain, not in order that man shall continue to bear the chain without fantasy or consolation, but so that he will throw off the chain and pluck the living flower. The criticism of religion disillusions man so that he will think, act, and fashion his reality like a man who has discarded his illusions and regained his senses, so that he will move around himself as his own true sun. Religion is only the illusory sun, which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. Marx was therefore not interested in simply criticizing illusions, but in addressing himself to those forms of theoretical and practical consciousness peculiar to existing reality that had become involved in the contradiction between their ideal function and their real prerequisites, to help them work through this contradiction, to develop from it the social truth, the social struggle, the need, the demands of reason it implicitly contains as its obligation and final goal. Thus, the critic, in a practical way, in this theoretical practice of immanent dialectical criticism, wins the interest of a large party, bringing out the true significance of the theoretical conceptions and practical goals they've adopted, and thereby compelling this party to go beyond its own confines, for its victory is at the same time its defeat. The achievement of its practical goals will prove inadequate, requiring further clarification, which the critic can anticipate through his theoretical grasp of the whole by grasping the practical consciousness that gave itself that goal as a limited expression of the social form within which it exists, or really of a self-contradictory dynamic of development in which this form, which had facilitated the practical life process of society, has become an obstacle to it, and hence must be transformed. In Paris, in 1843, Marx had found the definitive refutation of Ruge's pessimism concerning the prospects of a revolution in Germany, his lamentation of the Philistinism of the German people. In response to the fine elegy, the funeral song that was contained in Ruge's letter to Marx, to which he was responding, Marx wrote to his friend, "No people wholly despairs, even if for a long time it goes on hoping merely out of stupidity. Yet one day, after many years, it will suddenly become wise and fulfill all its pious wishes. Nevertheless, you have infected me. Your theme is still not exhausted. I want to add the finale. And when everything is at an end, give me your hand so that we may begin again from the beginning. Let the dead bury their dead and mourn them. On the other hand, it is enviable to be the first to enter the new life alive. That is to be our lot. It is true that the old world belongs to the Philistine, but one should not treat the latter as a bugbear from which to recoil in fear. On the contrary, we ought to keep an eye on him. It is worthwhile to study this Lord of the world. As for human beings, that would imply thinking beings, free men, republicans. The Philistines do not want to be either of these. What then remains for them to be and to desire? What they want is to live and reproduce themselves. And no one, says Goethe, achieves anything more. And that the animal also wants. The self-confidence of the human being, freedom, has first of all to be aroused again in the hearts of these people. Only this feeling, which vanished from the world with the Greeks and under Christianity disappeared into the blue mist of the heavens, can again transform society into a community of human beings united for their highest aims. You will not say that I have had too high an opinion of the present time. And if nevertheless I do not despair of it, that is only because it is precisely the desperate situation which fills me with hope. For our part, we must expose the old world to the full light of day and shape the new one in a positive way. The longer the time that events allow to thinking humanity for taking stock of its position, and to suffering humanity, to suffering mankind for mobilizing its forces, the more perfect on entering the world will be the product that the present time bears in its womb. That's the conclusion. Thank you.
All right, Reid, that was really, really extraordinary, wonderful, inspiring, imaginative, materially moving, I would say.
Thank you.
Great. So yeah, of course. Dimitar, did you have any questions?
Okay, I'm going to ask one thing. Reid said that uh, the Bismarck and the King Wilhelm in the 19th century, they said that the big worldly political questions won't be decided by discussions and votes, but by iron and blood. How would you think this proverb, is it still actual today, or do we now live in different times?
Well, I certainly think that's still the case. I think I cut it out, but I had a section when addressing LaSalle, discussing the Liberal Party in the Prussian Parliament, which um, since the accession of Wilhelm I, and he was actually the Prince Regent for some years before he actually became king. They saw in Wilhelm I so they
Is it
were.
an internet problem? For a moment, it seems that we lost you.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the last thing I said?
About Wilhelm being Prince Regent at the start.
Fray, and
Reid, the connection keeps dropping off. Should we go camera off to attempt to improve the bit rate?
sure. I'm sorry about that.
Quite all right.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, much better.
Okay, so LaSalle was essentially saying to the liberals, look, if you want a constitution, then you need to be able to, um, you need to be able to threaten the government with force because that's what the government's able to do to you. That's why uh, Bismarck was able to circumvent the rejection of the budget and collect taxes anyway because there were armed men to take the taxes. So LaSalle basically says to them, you need a force, and so who's going to fight for you, essentially. That's I think I had a passage in there about the practical servants. The government has practical servants. In other words, it has men with guns. So who's going to fight for you? And Marx and Engels fundamentally agree with that. Now, the liberals they actually put LaSalle on trial for treason. The liberals did for saying this because they were terrified of the prospect of a renewed revolution. For the most part, there was not all of them, but the core of the party certainly was. And so they were terrified of stirring up the working classes and putting guns in their hands. Now LaSalle's point, of course, is not, and nor Marx and Engels' point, is that it's all about a power grab. In fact, so something I unfortunately had to cut out was the whole. I mean, I've cut out a lot at the end. Really, I cut out the ending. But Marx and Engels, after 1848, they summarized the kind of perspective. I had already said they summarized their perspective in terms of the necessity of an independent political party of the working class. And they saw that basically on the model of the Chartists, and specifically on what the Chartists would be able to do once they had universal suffrage. So I had Engels mention that once once they had suffrage, because they had their party already, they would basically be in a position to take power. And that's why Marx said to the International that the prospect of a peaceful transition of power existed in countries like England as well as France at the time, which was this would have been 1871, so it would have been the Third Republic, which actually violently suppressed the Paris Commune, and the United States for that matter, because the working class already constituted a significant enough majority, not in the United States so much, at least not a proletarian working class at the time, although it was beginning to become the case. But because that combined with the fact that there wasn't a deeply entrenched state bureaucracy, in other words, a deeply entrenched, deeply developed bureaucracy administering an armed force capable of suppressing the people, that democracy would have, in and of itself, potentially at least, been enough to secure power. Because what you're doing when you fill up the parliament or the legislature with your representatives, or ostensibly what you're supposedly doing, is you're saying these people represent masses in society that, if they have arms, if they're trained in and organized as militia, that is the state. Whatever other professional military and police forces may exist, they're outnumbered by an enormous margin. And frankly, for that matter, a lot of their ranks are working men who would likely defect to the working class if there was an order given to suppress the working class. So is that still the case today? Yes. I mean, of course it is. Of course, state power still depends on force. That's not to say that there's no legitimacy in the law, but the question is, who's enforcing the law? Are they going to respect legality? Or say, if the workers were able, or not even the workers, if the liberals were able to impose a constitution on Bismarck's regime, on the government, say granting freedom of the press, and the government decided to start confiscating and censoring newspapers and shutting down publishing houses and printing presses and so on, well, then it's going to come down to a question of, are we going to stop the government from violating its own laws? That's a revolution. So the kind of conclusion they had come to, building upon these conclusions reached after 1848 through the experience of the International, but with the culminating in the resolution on political parties, but also importantly in the experience of the German party, where they had elected Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel first to the Reichstag of the new German Confederate. I think, I don't know, it was either the Confederation or the Empire. I'm not sure which it was at that point. Oh, it must have been, in any case, I don't want to get sidetracked, to oppose the war, among other things, to basically stand in the parliament, give voice to the position of the working class, and to essentially serve as a tribune of the people. So the idea is, in the parliament, they're not expecting to be able to do anything except rally their forces in defense of their position, so that when they got a large enough force that they were able to either actually, say, form a government of their own or establish a constitution in the case of Germany, that would have given them given the legislature power over the government, or for that matter, simply, be say violently suppressed, on the verge of being able to do that. That would be, then there would be a revolution. So Marx and Engels didn't think you could just have a spontaneous uprising, an insurrection in the style of the revolution of 1848 and the previous revolutions of 1830, 1789, and so on. They didn't think that was on the table anymore. And in fact, they warned against this kind of adventuristic insurrection, this politics of just kind of essentially rioting. They warned against that as as anything that would give the government the opportunity to violently suppress you would be suicide. Not because you won't eventually come into conflict with it, but because you're not in a position to do so yet. The position when you are able to do so, from their perspective, could be essentially measured with almost like a scientific accuracy by virtue of the way in which, the extent to which, the party is able to represent itself through, among other things, the electoral the electoral arena and parliamentary arena, as well as in society more generally through its press, its associations, its actions, its economic actions, strike actions, political demonstrations, etc. But you need all of those things together under the leadership of the party. And again, not the leadership of like the Marxists, right? Like, or Marx and Engels themselves, but under the leadership of the working men who have come to these conclusions through their experience as informed by the theoretical guidance of the Marxist intellectuals that they are being essentially voluntarily offered, not required to accept as a condition for any participation in the movement, which is the sectarian approach. So yes, it's still an issue. I mean, it's still an issue even if you leave completely aside the question of class struggle in the sense of proletarian class struggle, and socialism. It's still a lot. I mean, it's a live question in the United States today. People are talking about civil war on a regular basis because there's expected to be some kind of a constitutional crisis in the with this next election, or at least there's a possibility of it. Now, I don't think that's likely to happen, but it's certainly not impossible. And that is indeed how the only civil war we have had happened. It happened when a president was elected, in triggering a constitutional crisis. So, actually, one more note I'll make. Marx, I think this was in an unpublished piece, but a kind of a draft of something he wrote. He basically referred to the example of the Republican Party in the United States during the Civil War as the example of the only example in history of a revolution government. That's an interesting thought. But hopefully that answers the question. I don't know if either of you.
Dimitar, do you want to follow up?
No, not really. I just want to say thanks for the answer and for the lecture.
All right. Yes,
Thank you.
Reid, I have a question as well. I'd be interested in hearing you speak a little bit more to the sort of transnational circulation of parliamentary engagement
Mm-hmm.
in terms of proletarian struggle in the 19th century, right? Because you alluded to how the English Factory Act, with that Chartist victory, circulated onto the continent and was accepted. So yeah, I was sort of interested in how that took hold in Europe in addition to in England.
Well, it took time. So in England, it was wiped out after 1848. The Chartist movement was wiped out, like straightforwardly. And part of that was a lot of radical workers emigrated to the United States afterward, from all countries, but including England. Part of it was that most of the leadership of the party had been arrested or deported, exiled. And some of them made their way back, but some of them didn't. And for that matter, the Chartist movement before the revolution had been divided between a right wing and a left wing. And it was really only the left wing afterwards that was still even trying to kind of renew it. And Marx and Engels were they were urging, in particular, one of the leaders named Ernest Jones, to do everything he could to revive the Chartist movement in the 1850s, which he didn't end up making a great deal of headway with and ultimately abandoned. So what you end up having in England is the working class movement after that point is dominated by the trade unions and the cooperatives, primarily the trade unions, and both end up essentially fastening themselves. A lot of them were affiliated with the International. And part of the point of the International, at least for Marx's sake, the sense in which he thought there was a reason to participate in it, part of it was that he wanted to lead them further in the direction of political radicalization that he saw as demonstrated by their support for the U.S. Civil War, for the Union, I should say, in the Civil War, and against the British government's desire to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. So he wanted to urge them in that direction, but it ultimately does not end up panning out, and the labor movement in England ends up kind of suturing itself to the newly formed Liberal Party as a key constituency of it, and then eventually you get the Labour Party, but that's, we can leave that aside. On the continent, France is dominated by anarchism, not anarchism not Bakunanism, but it's not really anarchism in the sense that we might think of it, but it's on the one hand, it's Proudhonism, which is in a sense anti-political. It doesn't want to engage in politics, but it's not anti-government in the sense that Proudhon was willing to essentially court Louis Bonaparte in the same way LaSalle was willing to court Bismarck for aid for the working class. Proudhon doesn't quite. I don't think Proudhon necessarily goes as far in that direction as LaSalle does. And LaSalle, frankly, died pretty quickly after he began that endeavor. It was really his followers that followed up on it. So Proudhon's not exactly. So what Proudhon wanted was the government to, through an income tax, fund a bank, a people's bank, that would issue free credit to workers to form cooperatives and so on. Not terribly different from what LaSalle was advocating ultimately. The other side of it, of the French movement, was the Blanquists. Louis, as in not Louis Blanc, but who basically became a liberal after this point, but Auguste Blanqui, the revolutionary, who, while he was interested in a political struggle in the sense of a revolution that would overthrow state power, he wasn't interested in building a political force capable of wielding that power in the sense that Marx and Engels were thinking of it. It was more of the old style insurrectionism. And Bakunin is essentially a synthesis of those two perspectives. So France is and it lasts until the Paris Commune with the Franco-Prussian War, which is when the Third Republic is established. But the working class afterwards is still, in France, is still very much behind in the sense that they are reluctant to engage in political action in that form.
Reid, you've cut out again. I'm sorry. Reid, can you still hear us?
Oh, brother.
All right, we've got you back.
Oh, geez. I just realized why this is happening.
I see.
You hear me now?
Yes, clearly.
Yes, we do.
Now we cannot. Reid, are you still with us? Give it another minute and then turn to conclude. See if we can get Reid back.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back now.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I don't know what the heck is going. Well, I do know what's going on. I guess my Ethernet connection is broken, and I am on Wi-Fi. So I'm sorry about that. Um, so I'm not sure where I left off with what I was saying. Um, but essentially, you do have movement in this direction in all the major countries except for England that culminates in 1889 when these parties that had formed in the various countries united to form the Second International on the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. And so, Engels would spend the last few years of his life advising, as he had done previously with the separate parties, advising the Second International and essentially anticipating that with the growth of these parties, which in Germany in particular, the German party had been made illegal for over a decade under Bismarck. But they were still allowed to elect people to parliament as long as they're essentially kind of weren't openly espousing these views before they got elected. Once they were in the parliament, in the Reichstag, they had immunity, so they were able to do that. But otherwise, everything was underground for this period until I think it was 1890 or 1890 or 1891 that Bismarck left power and the anti-socialist law was repealed. So essentially, you have in Germany in particular, which is also at the same time beginning to rival England as an industrial power. You begin to have what looks like the makings of a new revolution. And essentially, Engels was looking at the election returns over these years and saying, at this rate, before the end of the century, we will have a majority, and then the revolution is inevitable. He was a little off because it didn't happen until 1912, but the period between 1905 and 1912 is a period of revolution is clearly in the air. And the question is, when is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? It's not whether it's going to happen anymore. Ultimately, of course, or if you don't know, the counter-revolution preempted it, which was what World War I was. It was, above all, it was a deliberate effort, specifically on the part of the German Empire, to destroy the Social Democratic Party and the International Socialist Movement by starting a war and compelling the party and the other governments, doing the same to support the national war effort instead of standing against the war in solidarity with the workers of the other countries, as Marx and Engels had recommended. And that is what happened. Almost every party's parliamentary fraction ended up supporting their national war effort. The Second International dissolved in disgrace, and with the exception of the Italian party and the American Party, and as well as the Bolsheviks in Russia, all of these parties were, sort of completely hobbled by what essentially seems like a coup from within, from their own parliamentary representatives. So that this gets at a whole other question that I had to cut out of this lecture, which is the flip side of sectarianism, which is opportunism. But I'll have to deal with that on a future occasion because I think we're out of time. So follow me on Twitter if you want to know more, and feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or want to talk about this or anything like that. So.
Indeed, and we'll certainly look forward to that. We'll look forward to you further developing this series, to your continuing this mode of thought, to exploring the afterlives of Marx and Engels into the 20th century, and yeah, all of your contemporary musings as always.
Thank you so much, and thank you again. Thank you to the School of Materialist Research. Thank you to everyone who's watched or will watch this, and I wish you all well, and proletarians of all countries unite.
Sounds good. Catch y'all on the flip side.